Now, there was a lot of interesting views from the video there, and let's take this straight to the panel. Nasir, do you think there are any specific occasions when the media has actually been biased against Islam?
I think, personally, I feel that it is becoming fashionable for the media to present Islam as in a certain way, and of course, along with that, use the terminology. To some extent, I think unintentionally, the media doesn't even realize that some of the terms which they use in relation to Islam, the Islamist and those kind of terms, which could be bordering towards being derogatory to some extent to some people who would feel strongly about it. But as I say, I think that is to some extent it's unintentional. But yes, it seems to be the call of the day as far as the media is concerned. Partly because of what's going on around us, around the world, since 9/11, and since some of the factions, quite truly, quite factually, some of the factions of Islam has played a very, very important role in doing so. We cannot turn away from that. But then it is the responsibility of the media to differentiate between those facts in terms of that, are they portraying Islam as a religion, or are they showing a certain faction or a certain group of people from within the Islamic society?
Right, okay. Let me just move over to the audience. Do you think there are any specific examples where Islam has been unfairly portrayed in the media? We've got a point at the back.
I mean, could I actually just say I'm not really too sure if this one is about the media and their kind of doing a bad job about it. I actually think that, as was said earlier, it's about organisations and governments briefing the press and giving them their statements and giving them their piece of paper to deliver the news. Now, in such a case, I think the way that the current discussion on Islam has been framed in society has been driven by largely the US and the UK briefing the press in terms of their statements and their speeches that their leaders have given. And then when the press are to report on that, they're going to use statements that these leaders have used within their speeches. And so what can the media do? They're not going to bypass certain terminology that these leaders have used. They're going to use it. And once that terminology is started to be used, these leaders will brief the press in the same manner over and over. So I'm talking about George Bush using terms like the axis of evil. I'm talking about terms of Islamic extremism. These kind of terminology are used over and over again. And I actually don't think that's largely the press's fault. As you said, I think they just kind of stumble along this path that has been generated by the politicians framing the issue. Okay. And in that manner it's kind of gone forward.
Just interrupt. If that is the case, then wouldn't that apply to every social issue, every news topic? It wouldn't just be about Islam, would it?
No, exactly. I think that is the large point in that kind of gets me thinking, and what I was quite interested to hear the panel say about that. And I think that a lot of it is about briefing the press and how those issues are framed, how those issues are sensationalized. The press have very little they can do with that, and as has already been said, they're trying to sell for an audience, and when that gets going, they're just adding fuel to the fire, and it's very difficult. I think the only way that this kind of situation longer term can be solved is through education of people, through schooling and education, and creating a...
So let's find out what the rest of the audience thinks about that.
I think that there's two sides to this. Earlier we touched that generally the media will always sensationalize something. So I think Muslims, Islam, we have a responsibility not to be oversensitive, because if you look at, for example, the average football fan will always complain that it's always the hooligans that get all the attention and not, the 99% of the other supporters who are peaceful. So I think Muslims have to accept that that's the way the media is, and that's one side of it. But then the second side of it again is, I mean, if you look at currently in the news, you've got the situation with Jeremy Bowen, who's the BBC correspondent in the Middle East. He's being criticised by the BBC Trust, quite obviously through acting as a mouthpiece for the very powerful Israeli lobby, that he's told the truth when the Gaza crisis happened. So there's two sides to the story, and I'm afraid, I think both sides are justified.
Okay, so do you think that is the case? What's the panel's views on that?
About bias, we also need to be very particular in the way that we explain a situation. For instance, in the area of whether there is a certain bias against Islam or Muslims isn't necessarily the same as saying that it's easy to pick on or highlight something to do with Islam or Muslims. I mean, the point was made earlier about terminology and how the press might be, if I understood you correctly, that the press simply needs to report what the world leaders are saying about a particular situation or what terminology they might be saying. If I could share a statement that was given by Tony Blair just after the US and British involvement in the airstrikes on Afghanistan. He said something quite encouraging, I think, from a Muslim point of view. This is what he said in October 2001, just after the start of the US and British military strikes on targets in Afghanistan. Mr. Blair said, quote, "This is not a war with Islam. It angers me, as it angers the vast majority of Muslims, to hear bin Laden and his associates described as Islamic terrorists. They are terrorists pure and simple. Islam is a peaceful and tolerant religion, and the acts of these people are contrary to the teachings of Islam." Now, that is something that Muslims will be very happy to hear. But the press also, to some degree, wants to retain its independence as well. It's not going to parrot fashion repeat everything a politician is going to say. In terms of the point that was made earlier by Nasir about that there might not be mischief intended behind the use of certain terms, some people might disagree with that, because there are certain terms that are used day in, day out that you could perceive as a deliberate attempt to undermine Muslims and Islam, in light of what Mr. Blair said just there, for instance. Now, we know that the term Islamic terrorists is still used, terms like jihad, terms like Sharia, even the caliphate. You know, there is a certain impression that is created by the media when it comes to reference to these terms as something that is referring to a backward ideology or a barbaric and bloodthirsty people who simply want the world to convert to Islam.
Well, it's interesting you touched on that point regarding the specific wording that's used and imagery. Gordon, do you think that's where the sort of bias comes about, the terminology that's always used?
It's not so much the terminology, but it's the people, it's the imagery. Television obviously is all about pictures, and we talked earlier about the fact that television news has also to be entertaining. So in order to tell the story and attract an audience, you have to tell a story in a colourful manner. And in order to tell a story in a colourful manner, sometimes you have to pick extreme people. We go for extremes, but I think that's where the feeling that there might be a bit of bias comes in.
Okay. So, Nasir, what about Islam in particular in the media?
Yes. Khalid, I was picking up from the point which Waqar was saying earlier on, and I would like Gordon to comment on that as well, that when we talk about, for example, Islamic terrorism or Islamic terrorist or Islamic bomb, and etc., etc., would you, back in the old days of IRA and the terrorism in Ireland, etc., we never heard anything like Christian terrorist or Catholic terrorist or anything like that. Why is not there is a comparison in that? I would have thought it's the same analogy, because there is sectarianism, there was a root cause of that. There were people who were of certain factions, certain school of thought, who were committing terrorist acts. But there was never an occasion where the media picked up on it and said, right, the Christian terrorists are doing this.
No, they don't. We live in a multicultural society now.
Well, so do we.
I'm just saying, the perception overall is it's multicultural, multi-religion, multi-faith, but I still think there is a hang-on to the past where we were seen as a Christian country, so you don't mention, you don't need to say Christian because it's perceived that that's a Christian country. But I think although the media is very forward-thinking, there is still a hark back to a kind of establishment that perhaps is a bit outdated now.